So today we're going to talk about the gastrointestinal system. And the gastrointestinal system is basically made up of two major parts, okay? So you have what's called the alimentary canal, plus you have the accessory organs. So this is your GI system. Now the alimentary canal is basically one big long tube that starts at the mouth, goes all the way to the anus. And then the accessory organs are the various different organs that secrete substances into this tube. So we'll talk about like the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas. And the whole idea of this gastrointestinal system, its entire function, is to digest our food. And that means we have to take that hamburger that we eat, or that potato, and we have to break it down into its microscopic components so that it can be absorbed through the wall of the intestine into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream into our cells so that the cells can use it for whatever they need it for, energy, building blocks, whatever. So we're basically going to go through in detail these first three steps. We're going to talk about the cephalic phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase of digestion. We're going to talk about basically two different types of digestion. We're going to talk about what's called mechanical digestion, and then we're going to discuss chemical digestion. Okay, so your essay for your final, the one that is absolutely for sure, is going to be the gastrointestinal tract. And you are going to talk about these three phases of digestion. And in each phase, you're going to talk about mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. If it doesn't apply to chemical or mechanical digestion, you don't talk about it. Okay? So, as we go along, I'll try to be very specific as to which phase and what kind of digestion it is. So let's talk about the cephalic phase. And basically the cephalic phase is all the digestive processes that occur before food even enters into your mouth. So now, after it enters into the mouth, it's actually still part of cephalic, but a lot of the digestive process actually starts before we even put the food in our mouth. But cephalic ends when the food enters into the stomach, okay? So in the cephalic phase, we're going to start with what's called anticipation. Now in anticipation, this means we have some kind of sensory input about food. So maybe you smell food, or you see it, or even somebody could be talking about it. So, you know, maybe you didn't eat breakfast this morning, and I start talking about warm pancakes, you know, with the butter melting on top, or bacon, you know, how good it smells. And you start, people are shaking their head, don't do that to me. Exactly. So what it does is it actually starts the digestive process because the brain thinks, oh, well, she's listening to food. Thank you. She's listening to food, or somebody talk about food, must mean she's going to be starting to eat food soon. So we have, under anticipation, we have sensory input about food. And of course, we think about this, and then the sensory input is sent to a very important part of the brain called the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus is a pretty complex area of the brain. So if you look at the hypothalamus in the brain, it's hooked directly to the pituitary gland. And you have an anterior pituitary, and you have a posterior pituitary, and you remember these guys secrete different hormones. Posterior, we talked about this the other day, it secretes antithyroid hormone. Another one it secretes, we'll talk about later, called oxytocin. That's supposed to be the love hormone. The more oxytocin you make, the more in love you become. I don't know. And then anterior pituitary secretes all kinds of things. We'll talk about this, like LH and FSH, which is helping with reproduction. It secretes thyroid stimulating hormone. It secretes growth hormone. Let's see, what else does it secrete? I can't think right now. It secretes ACTH. It makes another one we'll talk about with reproduction called prolactin. This helps with production of milk. So anterior pituitary secretes a lot. Now the hypothalamus, it's made up of neurons. It's all part of the brain. Got a lot of neurons in it. And you see these neurons kind of grouped together in bundles. So have different neurons grouped in different regions all together. And anytime in the central nervous system you have neurons grouped together, are you laughing at my neurons? I can't believe that.
It's like a really cute face. It looks like an owl.
It does, doesn't it? Again. I'm good at that. Anytime you have neurons grouped together like this in the central nervous system, we call them nuclei. And there's multiple different nuclei in the hypothalamus. And these nuclei control different things. So they control many of the hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. Like, for instance, corticotropin releasing hormone. That goes and causes ACTH to be released. Or thyroid releasing hormone. That comes from the anterior pituitary and causes us to release thyroid stimulating hormone. So there's a lot of different hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. Interestingly enough, they're actually released from these neurons. So they're kind of sort of neurotransmitters, but they're also hormones because they go into the bloodstream. So they're a little bit different. They actually even call them neurohormones. But there's a group of neurons that also controls things like our sleep-wake cycle. How long you sleep, how well you stay awake, that kind of thing. And then there are some of these neurons in the hypothalamus that help to control how hungry you are or how full you feel. So we call this the hunger satiety center. Excuse me. So this hypothalamus helps us to know whether we're hungry or whether we feel totally full, we're satisfied, we have satiety. Now, unfortunately, there are a small group of children who are born each year in the world, maybe about 50 around the world, that are actually born without a satiety portion of the hunger satiety center. So if you think about that, they never feel full. They feel hungry, but they never feel full. Imagine your life where you're hungry, and not a little hungry. You're starving all day long, all night long. All you think about is food. This genetic defect is what we would refer to as the Prader-Willi Syndrome. About 10, 15 years ago now, there was a young girl, 9 years old, who was found chained to her bed in her parents' apartment in San Francisco. And neighbors had called on these parents a number of times. They called CPS because this 9-year-old girl was extremely obese. At 9 years old, she weighed 350 pounds. So when they found this girl chained to her bed, they obviously took her away and arrested the parents for child abuse. While the parents were in jail trying to get their way out of it, the little girl went to school. She was in 3rd grade and was talking to the teacher and had a massive heart attack and died. And very lucky, unlucky, I guess you might say, for the parents. When she died, the medical examiner in San Francisco, a very smart man, decided to look at this little girl's brain. And what he found was that she did not have a satiety center. Those neurons were absent. And so he was able to diagnose her with Prader-Willi Syndrome. And when the story all came out, the parents said they knew there was something different about their newborn baby because she was never full. They gave her bottles and she would drink and then she would scream and they'd have to give her another one and they just keep feeding and feeding and feeding her. So by the time she was 6 months old, she was already extremely obese. By the time she was able to crawl, she would go into the kitchen and like open up cupboards and start eating all the food in there. So they had to like put the food up. Eventually she was able to open the refrigerator and eat the food inside. They had to put a lock on the refrigerator. They locked all their cupboards up. She eventually figured out how to take the hinges off. So they decided no food in the house. They were taking her to all kinds of doctors. Nobody had any idea what was wrong with her because this is extremely rare. 50 people around the world may have it. You don't see it very often. And so when they had no food in the house, when she got old enough, she'd sneak out at night and go beg people for food on the streets of San Francisco. And so eventually the parents were like, we didn't know what to do, so we just changed her to the bed. Because we knew she was going to die because she just ate all the time. And so obviously this is a big problem. Now, really strange, I actually had a student a few years ago in my class who had Prader-Willi Syndrome. And so after we got done, well, actually she told me about it on the very first day of class. I talked to her more throughout the semester. But she came up to me on the first day, told me she had Prader-Willi, and I looked at her and went, right. Because she was very thin. Very pretty young lady, very thin. And I'm like, okay. And she goes, yeah, because I have Prader-Willi, I have to leave my phone on. I'm thinking, okay, I've heard a lot of stories from students, but this is really kind of crazy for you wanting to keep your cell phone in class, because, yeah, okay. And she said, no, you don't understand. People are going to be coming into class. I'm going to get text messages, maybe even a phone call. I have to keep it on. And I'm like, okay, you've got to explain this to me. And she said, because she has Prader-Willi, she can't control herself. So her family, this girl was one lucky person, her family agreed that they would call her, text her, or come and see her every 30 minutes around the clock, 24 hours a day. And so somebody would like walk in the door. She used to sit right there. They'd whisper in her ear. And I finally asked her, okay, so what are they telling you? And she says, all they're saying is, remember, don't eat. It's okay. You don't have to eat. We know you're hungry. Just don't eat. And when she was little, okay, somebody always was with her. They would lock the door from the outside. One of her parents would sleep in the room with her. Mom or dad went to school with her. And she said that they've been saving my life. And I'm like, you are so lucky that you have a family like that will take care of you like that. Because you don't normally see that. And what she's also lucky about is they had a really good family doctor that diagnosed her very early on. They did an MRI scan of the brain and they were able to figure out what was going on with her. And so the family was very prepared. As a little girl, they were prepared to figure out how to deal with this. So they were very, very lucky. But it is a very rare disease. Now, it could happen to us. Even though we have a hunger satiety center, all you got to do is say to yourself, I'm going on a diet. And the minute you say that, you're hungry. Have you ever done that? It's like, okay, right now I'm not on a diet, so I'm not really thinking about food. But when I say, okay, that's it, I'm going on a diet, bam, I'm hungry. And all of a sudden, like 3 o'clock in the morning, you find your head in the refrigerator, you don't know how you got there, okay? Because this hunger satiety center is strong. It is extremely powerful. And the minute that your brain thinks, oh my gosh, she's going to deprive me of food, are you kidding? I need to tell her to eat. This is bad. This is very bad. The hypothalamus gets scared and will give us more of a hunger drive. So that's why it's so hard to go on these diets, especially the kind of diets where you feel hungry. It's almost impossible because your brain is working against you to get you to eat again. So you have to go on a diet where you're frigging always eating. Have you ever noticed these two? Okay, they are always frigging eating. And how much weight have the two of you lost so far?
I've gone down 2 pant sizes since classes started.
Okay.
And I lost 22 pounds.
Okay. And you all are sitting here not eating anything, and they are always frigging eating, and they're losing tremendous amounts of weight. And are you ever hungry?
They start
No.
eating
Oh.
them.
You got to start eating more. You people don't eat enough.
And eat the right type of food.
That's right.
Stay away from your sugars.
I actually, my son had to go get him pizza the other night. I went, got it, brought it home, didn't eat one piece.
Good job.
I already
We had a friend who brought us a whole bunch of cupcakes the other day. Beautiful chocolate cupcakes. I'm like, what are you thinking? Well, they're all gluten-free and everything. That doesn't mean they're carb-free. It's like, what are you thinking? She goes, well, what are you going to do with them? I'm like, either you take them back or the bloodhounds get cupcakes. She goes, no, let's give them to the bloodhounds. So they all got cupcakes.
Could have brought 2 of those.
Heck no. There are only 4 of them, so couldn't do that. All right, so the hypothalamus now, when it is stimulated, okay, because we're hungry, what it's going to do is instead of stimulating the sympathetic nervous system like it does under stress, it's going to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. So remember, parasympathetic is about resting and digesting, okay? And the parasympathetic is then going to do all those things that you think about or feel when you get hungry, okay? So one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to have an increase in what we call gastric motility. That means the muscles are going to start contracting and you're going to feel that kind of rumbly in your tummy type of thing. Also, what's going to happen is the stomach's going to start secreting different chemicals we'll talk about a little later for digestion. So you're going to have an increase in what we would call gastric juices. So now you even hear the roaring of the stomach as everything's moving around. Another thing that happens too is when we start to get hungry or we start to think or smell food, we start to salivate more. So parasympathetic is what increases salivation. Now, because the brain thinks we're going to eat something, another thing that has to happen is, remember, there's a sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach. That sphincter has to relax so that food can come down. Okay? What do we call that sphincter? Okay, so in anatomy, you probably learned it as the Gastroesophageal Sphincter. We do not call it that in the hospitals. We don't call it that in medicine. So what we're going to call it the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay? Because it's on the low end of the esophagus. So this is the lower esophageal sphincter. That's what you're going to call it in the medical field. Even though officially it is the gastroesophageal sphincter. But that has to relax in order for food to enter into the stomach. So all these things are happening in preparation of you getting ready to eat that food. Okay? Now, the next thing that's going to happen in the cephalic phase after anticipation is hopefully we have food to put in our mouth. And so then we have to go through the process called mastication. Okay? This is simply chewing. Alright, so talk a little bit about what's going on in the mouth. So, of course, the teeth are going to be important in this process, and the tongue is going to be also important, but so are the salivary glands. Okay, so let's talk first about the teeth just a little bit. You know, obviously, what the teeth are doing. They're helping to tear and to chew, to crush the food so that we can break it down into smaller pieces so that it makes it easier to swallow. you don't have teeth, it's really, really hard to swallow that food. You're going to have to grind it up, turn it into a liquid before you're going to be able to swallow it. Now, just a couple things about teeth, and this is not part of your essay, okay? Just want you to know this. So I've had students over the years who they either can't get in to see a dentist, or maybe they don't have the money or the insurance for a dentist, and they come in here, they've got a bad toothache, and they're like, oh, doctor, can you look at this, and it's infected, and I'm like, you know what, I know you don't have any dental insurance, but you got medical insurance, go to a doctor, because it's infected. Now look, our teeth have a couple different parts to it. On the outside, the crown of the tooth has what we call enamel, okay? Now, enamel is the hardest substance in the human body. It's very difficult to destroy enamel. And we want that really hard substance around the teeth because underneath this enamel are living cells, which are called the dentin. Now, these living cells, since they're living, they have to be fed. There has to be a blood supply. There has to be a neurological supply. So the middle of all of our teeth are hollowed. This hollow region is actually called the root canal. That's not the process you have at the dentist. That's really what we call it. This is the root canal. And inside the root canal are blood vessels and nerves. So what if I don't have any enamel on my tooth? Well, our mouths are full of bacteria, viruses, fungi, even sometimes parasites, depending on what we eat, okay? And those suckers can get right through these living cells, right through the dentin, and directly into our bloodstream. Now, a lot of times, once it gets into the bloodstream, you're going to get infection in the blood, which is what we call sepsis, and of course, this could kill you. So it's no joke if a tooth gets infected or you get a hole in the enamel, which is what we would call a cavity, or officially it's called a dental carie, okay? That's no joke. And a lot of times, okay, notice the gums here, or what they call the gingiva. They will go up above, in a healthy person, up above the enamel, because the enamel will end, and eventually you get to the dentin. But if somebody gets an infection, a lot of times this gum swells up and it pulls away from the tooth, or it erodes and it exposes the dentin this way. So even if you don't have a hole in the enamel, the dentin is exposed to all that bacteria. And so a person with an infection in the mouth can end up with infection in the bloodstream. Now here's the really bad thing. Every single student I have ever sent to the doctors because they have an infection in the mouth, they've been turned away. Because the nurse who's looking at them and doing the triage says, we're not a dental office. I'm thinking, how stupid can you be? The mouth is part of the body. It is connected. And not only that, but remember we have the eustachian tube? That's a tube at the back of the throat that helps to drain our throat. And that tube goes from the back of the throat here, up around your jawline, into your middle ear. And if I have an infection in my mouth and I'm laying down at night, that infection can drip up my eustachian tube and go into my middle ear. Give me a middle ear infection, or what we call otitis media. But that's not even the worst part. If I get a middle ear infection, there is an opening in the middle ear that goes to my brain. So that if I have, let's say, an abscessed tooth that's infected, I could actually eventually get an infection on my brain. I could get an infection into my bloodstream. I could get an infection onto my brain. I met a young man, he was 16 years old, and his mom and dad were both speeders. And he complained to his mom about having an abscessed tooth. She didn't do anything for him. And over time, he actually got an infection first in the bones of his skull. He got an ear infection, and then an infection in the bone, and then eventually an infection on the brain. And one of his high school teachers noticed there was something really seriously wrong with him, and they took him to the hospital. But when I met him, he was already a vegetable living in a nursing home for the rest of his life. He was very lucky. I guess you could say it didn't kill him, but he had so much brain damage. I mean, he's probably dead by now because he just couldn't move, couldn't do anything, couldn't think. And that was from a tooth infection. So when you see a patient come in to you because they don't have dental insurance, it's harder to get than medical, okay? They don't have dental insurance, frigging take care of them. Because now you know the potential outcome. An abscess, an infected tooth of any kind, can kill your patient. And the tooth is connected to the rest of our body. Okay? It's very important. You're a medical professional that takes care of the body, the whole body. Don't be lazy. Don't be dumb.
Well, what would you do in that case?
You give them antibiotics.
Get some pliers?
Well, yeah. I mean, seriously, if that's...
I would, man.
Honestly, that's what comes down to it, but you have to have antibiotics. Even if you pull that tooth out, it's not going to stop the infection.
So if the patient dies and you turn them away, you're responsible, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's absolutely correct. You personally are legally liable, as well as the facility that you're working for.
What are like some of the clear signs for like an infected tooth aside from like pain and all
It
that?
hurts
That's it?
really bad, no matter what you do. And then eventually you can see the infection building up around the tooth. It could turn green, it could be pussy,
Alright.
a lot of different things, yeah. And usually painkillers, don't touch it at all. Doesn't make a difference. Oh, I thought you had your hand up.
Dr. Harvey,
Hang on a second.
can a person with anemia can lose their gum?
Say it again?
A person with anemia
What about it?
can lose their gum?
Oh, yes. Okay, so anemia. There's all kinds of different types of anemia. But basically anemia means you don't have the ability to carry as much oxygen as you need. And one of the things we see when somebody has really bad anemia over a long time is the gums will start to turn kind of a light pink, almost white color. And they can start to erode away. In animals, you look for sickness in their gums. You lift their gums up to look to see what color they are. And we have a really sweet goat. She's a milk goat, and she was just not doing so well, so we lifted her gums, and they were pure white. And usually in an animal like that, it's because they don't have enough vitamin B12, which helps us to make red blood cells. And so she was very, very anemic. We got the vet to call in a prescription of injectable vitamin B12. It was really funny because went to CVS to pick it up, and she's like, "What's the name of your child you're picking this up for?" And I said, "Oh, her name is Midnight," and because she's black. And she's like, "Oh, that's an interesting name." I'm like, "Yep."
Got some hippies over here.
Yep, and she's really weird looking too. She's the kind of goat that doesn't have ears.
Oh.
So she's called a La Mancha goat, and they don't have any ears, so she's really funky looking. But they make a lot of milk, so they're awesome.
Dr. Harvey, there are some people like, because it's too bad, their teeth is so bad, they have a hole in their cheek.
Yes.
What happened to that?
That's infection, usually from the teeth.
From here. It's next to
Yep.
cheek hole.
Infection that went too far.
Between two.
All right, now, salivary glands. So if you remember, we've got like the parotids back here, and the sublingual under the tongue, submandibular along the jawline, okay, and they are secreting saliva. Now, saliva is made up of mostly water, okay, so our saliva is like 99% water. And water can dissolve anything you eat. Even you put a piece of steak in water long enough, it'll dissolve it. So a lot of times you'll hear people refer to water as the universal solvent because it can just dissolve anything. I mean, you leave a ship in water long enough and it's going to start to dissolve, okay? So we have water mostly making up our saliva, but we also have a very important enzyme in the saliva for digestion, and this enzyme is called amylase. Now what amylase does is it helps to digest complex carbohydrates, so like breads and pastas and corn, things like that, okay? And it dissolves it down into its smaller parts which would be the simple sugars. So this is why sometimes, you know, when you eat corn, especially really ripe corn, you start chewing on it and immediately it starts to taste sweet because the amylase is already dissolving these complex carbohydrates. Now, by the way, our saliva has a lot of different enzymes in it, but this is the only one that helps with digestion. Almost all the other ones are to help kill bacteria so that we don't get too much bacteria in the mouth. That would be really bad. Okay? Now, I will tell you the parotid glands, they're a little bit different. They actually don't secrete water. They don't secrete amylase. They just make mucus. And so what they're going to help to do by making this mucus is to help the food to slide down a little bit easier. Okay? And it won't be quite as scratchy. So we make a lot of mucus, and then we're going to use that tongue. And the tongue is really important as far as the swallowing process is concerned. So next, after we've chewed the food, and by the way, one of the things the tongue is doing while we're chewing the food is it's moving the food around. Okay? So it moves it back and forth, moves it forward and back so that we can chew it better. Eventually, right before we swallow the food, the tongue is going to roll all the food up into a nice ball. Okay, you've probably, like as a kid, shown people your bowl of food, you know, look, go and eat it. And so the tongue rolls it into a nice ball, so it makes it a lot easier to swallow. And as the tongue is rolling it into a ball, all that mucus is covering and throughout that entire ball, or what we would call a bolus of food. Okay, so that bolus is the ball of food that we're going to swallow. And the swallowing process is what we call deglutition. Okay, so this is the swallowing process. Now, swallowing is not part of mechanical or chemical digestion. So this is not part of your essay. Okay, now before we go into that real quick and then we'll take a break, I'm going to tell you one other thing about the parotids. Because these childhood diseases are on the rise again. Measles and mumps, okay? And you're going to see them in the hospitals. It's highly unfortunate, but it's because people are not vaccinating their kids, okay? And, you know, I understand where they're coming from, because in the good old days, when I got vaccinated, they didn't have all these artificial chemicals in these vaccines. And these vaccines now are just full of this chemical crap. I don't know why. They could easily take them all out. We're all alive, you know. Those vaccines with all the chemicals worked. And there is some proof to show that these excess chemicals are causing damage in children. Okay? One of my daughters, she has a couple kids, and when they were little, she asked me, what would you do? Would you vaccinate or would you not? And I told her, I said, you know what? I would vaccinate. Because these childhood diseases of measles and mumps kill children. And I said, I'd rather have a child with autism than a child dead. I'm sorry, that would just be my choice. And luckily, you know, her kids were, you know, not really affected by it. And it could be that there's a genetic component in the child where they're going to be much more likely to be affected by this vaccine than somebody else's kids. And this is why we have some children with the problem and some children without. Nobody really understands this yet. There's not been a lot of good studies. But measles and mumps are very dangerous childhood diseases, especially if you get them as an infant, because you get really high fevers. I got the mumps when I was a kid because they didn't have a vaccine way back in the Stone Ages. And I can remember, my brother and I had it at the same time. We both ended up hospitalized. He had 108 fever, I had 106. And so the fevers go really high. And boy, I'll tell you, I don't think I've ever been so sick in all my life. You know, I was only 10 years old, but I still remember how sick I was. And measles are not really much better. I'd say the mumps are the worst, but measles are pretty sucky to have too. Now, you know somebody has the mumps because they infect the parotid glands first. And so you get this weird swelling back here. It's not like they've got a chipmunk face, but they've got a weird swelling here. So the mumps swell in front of the ears. The measles swell behind the ears. So you look at somebody who has these red spots and this swelling behind the ears, and most likely it's the measles, because there's just really nothing else that does that. So it kind of helps you to gauge what's going on with this person, and of course, get them
How's
quarantined.
it transmitted?
I cough on you. Yeah, it's all salivary transmission.
Which one's more deadly?
Parotid.
The measles, right?
No, the mumps are more deadly.
Parotid.
The mumps are going to be more deadly.
And then that's swallowing.
And by the way, okay, when you get into the nursing program, you will have to have vaccinations again. The likelihood is the vaccines that you had as a kid are no good now. Used to be thought that vaccines lasted you your entire life. That's not true. About 4 years ago, I woke up and I had this really bad cough. And I wasn't sick the day before. I just woke up and had this cough. And I instantly knew, because it's a weird sounding cough. And I instantly knew I had whooping cough. And I'd been vaccinated for that as a kid. And it was like, oh crap, okay, got pertussis. Nothing you can do about it. So you most likely, all of you now, are probably too old. And so your pertussis vaccine is no good either. So they have all the whooping cough vaccines out now too. So you'll probably have to get all those vaccines again. Just keep your fingers crossed that diphtheria doesn't come back. Because that disease right there, I don't care if it causes autism in adults. I'm going to go out and get vaccinated for that. Because diphtheria creates like a membrane that will grow on the back of your throat and block off your trachea. And you cannot cut it out because it becomes infiltrated with blood vessels. And if you cut that membrane, you'll bleed to death. So if you get diphtheria, you're going to die. It is a nasty disease. So fingers crossed we never see that in the United States again. I can remember friends of mine dying of diphtheria as a kid. Okay, so that's how short of a time, really, in the United States that diphtheria was still here.
Remember going to school and having the nurses go through and
Oh yeah,
shoot you
you
in
had to
both arms
stand
for
in
your
line
immunizations?
and then give you the little
Uh-huh.
sugar cube for polio and everything. Yeah.
They're all looking
And
at
your
you.
parents had no say. Your parents had absolutely no say. There was none of this crap, oh, I'm opting out. You all just stood in a line. They didn't tell your parents they were doing it, and everybody got a shot that day. I got the shot that day, and I think 2 days later I had the measles. Because sometimes you get it from that. My parents were like, oh, great. Of course, my stupid kid would get it. So deglutition, this is swallowing. So notice we have this bolus of food here that gets pushed to the back of the throat, and then bam, a reflex happens. Now the reflex is 2 parts. One, notice the epiglottis here, okay? It closes down over the trachea so you don't get food in your lungs. And then the second thing is the uvula moves up so you don't get food in your nose. And it goes down the esophagus like it's supposed to. Now the problem here, okay, is that if you are laughing or talking while you are eating, the brain goes, huh, she's talking, which also means she has to breathe. But she's trying to swallow. So which one is more important? Oh yeah, breathing. So none of this reflex will happen. So your uvula stays where it's at, the epiglottis doesn't go down, so you either get it in your trachea or you snort food out your nose. Yeah. Very embarrassing, okay? Milk cups flying out your nose. So don't do that laughing, talking thing while eating so that it has the opportunity to go down the esophagus. All right, so once we swallow this food, it has to go down the esophagus. And if you remember, we talked about before that the esophagus is not an open tube. It's more like, like those balloons that you use to blow up and make animals out of, they're the long, flat ones. Well, the esophagus is long and flat. And it's made out of just muscle. That's really all the esophagus is. So when you push food down the back of your throat, that bolus of food forces the esophagus open. And the muscles around it kind of relax, so you get like this little pocket where the food is at. But below it, the esophagus is still flat. So it can't just slide right on down. So instead, what has to happen is the area right below this bolus of food, the muscles have to contract the esophagus open. And then the bolus still doesn't even move, even though there's a pocket below it now. Instead, the muscles above it contract in and push that bolus into the pocket. And then you'll open another pocket below, and the muscles above will contract and push the bolus down into the next pocket. And then you open another pocket below, and then the bolus of food pushes it down into the next pocket. You've probably felt this. So like maybe, let's say you ate peanut butter or something, you know, on bread, and you didn't have anything to drink. And you feel like it's stuck here, and then it moves here, and then slowly it moves here, and then it moves here, and you're thinking, oh, please, God, kill me now because it hurts so bad. And eventually you can feel it slowly move into the stomach, and then you don't feel it anymore. That's the pocket opening, pushing it down. Opening, pushing it down. That type of movement is called peristalsis. Or you'll hear people call it peristaltic waves. Now, the entire alimentary canal moves by peristalsis. So that tube, all the way down the esophagus, all the way through the small intestine, is going to move the food by this peristalsis. Okay? Now, by the way, our entire alimentary canal, I mean, it could be as long as 30 feet long, okay? And it is always moving, even if you don't eat. It's constantly moving. So like about every 3 minutes, you'll see these peristaltic waves move all the way through all 30 feet, just to make sure nothing gets stuck in there. Now, when we do eat, the waves move faster, more than once every 3 minutes. They're moving a lot faster to try to push that food all the way through the canal into each area so that the digestive processes can occur. Now, as that bolus moves down the esophagus, eventually it goes through the lower esophageal sphincter and enters into the stomach. Now, in the stomach, we're going to talk about a bunch of different processes, but one of the things that we need to talk about is the mechanical process of digestion. So we're going to start with the gastric phase, and let me go back just for a second, because I didn't actually mention this in particular, I forgot, in the cephalic phase. So the chewing of the food in the mouth is mechanical. Everything else we talked about, the hypothalamus, parasympathetic nervous system, salivary glands, those are all chemical. Okay? So just the chewing is mechanical. So in the gastric phase, as far as mechanical digestion is concerned, there's going to be two things involved. The muscles of the stomach, as well as the rugae. So when we look at the stomach, you have the fundus at the top, right by the lower esophageal sphincter, which as soon as the food enters, it closes. And then at the bottom of the stomach, pyloric region, you have the pyloric sphincter, and it closes. So that food can't leave that stomach because the sphincter at the top and the bottom are both closed. Now, food stays in the stomach for a particular amount of time, digesting depending on what kind of food it is. So let's say that we eat something that is made up of mostly carbohydrates. So maybe you eat fruit or rice or vegetables. Those only stay in the stomach for about 2 to 4 hours. They're pretty easy for the stomach to digest. Other foods, such as proteins, so maybe you eat a steak or a hot dog or chicken, it takes a little bit more to digest that, so it'll stay in the stomach for about 4 to 6 hours. If it's more of a fatty food, it will stay in the stomach longer, which is about 6 to 8 hours.
Are there receptors?
Just gonna go there. Oh, excellent. Glad you're thinking that way. So as soon as food goes into the stomach, kind of like the lungs, in the walls of the stomach, we also have stretch receptors. So as soon as the food goes in, it stretches our stomach. Now, in a healthy person, the stomach, when it's not full, no food in there, has a lumen of only maybe about yay big. Not very big at all. So when we put food in, it obviously is going to stretch out. So those stretch receptors are going to be stimulated. And they send information to the satiety center in the hypothalamus and say, hey, look, we're really stretched out. We want you to know that we're nice and full. You don't need to eat anymore. And the nice thing is, the longer the stomach is stretched out, so the longer food stays in the stomach, the longer you feel full and you don't need to eat.
So that's why when we eat higher fat, we're not hungry.
Yes. Because a very high fat, yes, even protein meal, very high fat meal stays in the stomach, keeps it stretched, tells the hypothalamus, hey, you can feel full for a longer period of time. Whereas if you're eating mostly carbohydrates, you could be hungry in 2 hours or less, depending on how quickly it empties, because now it doesn't stretch anymore. So you're not sending that information to the hypothalamus. Now, here's a problem. Because we're humans, and even if our stomach tells the hypothalamus we're not full, that doesn't mean we have to listen, okay? Because like, ice cream doesn't do anything but like sort of fill in the cracks. So you can eat plenty of that after dinner, right? Okay? So as humans, we sometimes have a tendency to eat even when we are full. Because, we're talking and not really paying attention, having a good time, and we can overeat. Now, some people really can do that to excess. A lot of times it's a family thing, it's the way they're taught to eat. They end up eating a lot of food. And so the stomach actually starts stretching out more. And the stomach has a lot of elastic connective tissue in it, but now think about a rubber band. If I stretch a rubber band out and I hold it there for a long period of time. So let's think about people who, like, they eat all day long. They never give the stomach time to really empty. So you're stretching that stomach out and holding it there for a long period of time. What happens to that rubber band that I just hold and hold and hold day after day, hours and hours? It loses elasticity. It's not as stretchy. So for some of these people, their stomach will get bigger and stay bigger. Now, what's the problem? If my lumen, which naturally should be this big, now becomes permanently this big, what becomes the problem for me?
You want to eat more?
Exactly. I got to eat more to stretch it out more to feel full. So the more I eat continuously, the less stretchy my stomach's going to be, and the bigger it's going to be, so the more I have to eat to fill it.
That was my question.
Okay. So many years ago now, the very first autopsy I ever did was on a woman who weighed about 1,000 pounds. And when we first did the autopsy, you do a Y incision, you take off the rib cage, and then you look inside this person, and there's nothing but fat. I mean, lots of fat. So you have to scoop out all this excess fat. And if I remember right, I think we scooped out about 12 buckets of fat to be able to get down to all of the abdominal organs. So once all the fat was gone, the first thing I started looking for was her heart. I couldn't find it. I mean, I literally could not find it. I'm looking everywhere, and I'm thinking, okay, this is ridiculous. She had to have a heart. Okay, I can't find it. And so I finally had to go to somebody else, and I'm like, okay, I'm really embarrassed, but I can't find her heart. And they're looking at me like, okay, what kind of stupid idiot are you? Of course she's got a heart. They come, they're looking, they couldn't find her heart. I'm like, okay, better now. Well, what we ended up doing is kind of sort of accidentally, we turned over the rib cage to look at it that was sitting on a tray, and most of her heart was stuck to the rib cage. So here's one of the other things that happens cardiovascular-wise as we put on excess amounts of weight. Those are fat cells that we're growing, and fat cells are living cells. And any living cell has to be fed. So we have to grow more blood vessels. The more fat we put on, the more blood vessels we grow. And the more blood vessels we grow, the harder the heart has to work to pump that blood out to all those blood vessels. So initially, my heart starts working harder, and it's kind of like, when you work out at a gym, you're working out a little harder, what happens to the size of your muscles? They get bigger, okay? Now, when muscles get bigger, okay, they do not rip and tear and then grow back together. Okay, I'm sorry, it doesn't happen that way. all that happens is your muscles start to go through protein synthesis. They make more actin and myosin. So when the muscle gets bigger, you have more actin and myosin, you also become stronger because you have greater force of contraction. So each muscle cell is going to get bigger. And so the muscle gets bigger, what we call hypertrophy of the muscle. But all of us, without any outside help, we only can get to a certain genetic muscular size, okay? It's like if I work out, I'm not going to become, like the Incredible Hulk. It's just not going to happen. Some people can. I have a really dear friend, and he's been in the Olympics several times, and he's been in there for weightlifting. And this man is a mountain, okay? He's just a huge individual. And so he grows his muscles, and naturally they get bigger because genetically he can do that. Now, if I want to do it illegally, I can give myself shots of testosterone because testosterone stimulates protein synthesis. This is why men and women should never exercise together because they're always going to kick your butt no matter what, okay? Because they can grow more muscle than a woman can, all right? So as far as the heart is concerned, it does the same thing. When it initially starts pumping out to these extra blood vessels, it gets bigger, it gets stronger. But our heart can also only get to a genetic big size. But it doesn't know that. So what it tries to do is it tries to grow bigger. But instead, as I put on more weight, more blood vessels, my heart now elongates. And it gets longer, and the muscle stretches out and becomes thinner. So with this woman, instead of your heart, which is usually about the size of your fist, instead of it being the size of her fist, her heart was about this long. Okay? No exaggeration. And what happened was her heart was actually paper thin. You could see through it. So it had stuck to her thoracic cage. And when I took the thoracic cage off, I basically ripped the majority of the heart out. We were able to tease it off the thoracic cage and kind of fit it back on. And what we saw was she had actually bled internally, or what we call exsanguinated. And the reason was because her left ventricle pumped one time. And it was so thin, it blew a hole in the left ventricle. And then she bled out. So we could kind of jigsaw puzzle the heart back together and see a hole about this big in her left ventricle. So this is one of the problems with obesity, is that you have cardiovascular problems, but your stomach also stretches. So when we looked at her stomach, and again, our stomachs are typically pretty small. Her stomach was huge. So if you took that stomach, which was probably about maybe this long, but you blew it up, what you do, fill it with water, you can see the size of the woman. I mean, that woman would have had to probably eat 3 to 5 times what you would normally eat in a day to just try to fill that stomach up, okay, because the lumen's so big. So she doesn't get any stretch. So she's never full. She's almost like a Prader-Willi Syndrome person. She never feels full, which is why doctors came up with the Gastric Bypass, okay? So in Gastric Bypass, this is what they used to do. First type of Gastric Bypass. They came in right here with the body of the stomach, and they stapled it off. And the idea was, if they could staple this off, 2 things. One, you only have this small pocket here that food would enter. Maybe they would get a little bit of a stretch and feel fuller. And maybe if this isn't being stretched out all the time, it would grow back, become a little more elastic, more healthy, and they could take the staples off. Didn't happen. It didn't grow back, it didn't repair, and one of the big problems was if you stapled it too hard, there was no blood flow to the region, and naturally we have gangrene in our stomach. It's just a natural phenomenon, and many of these patients died of gangrene because not enough blood flow, gangrene is anaerobic, and it just flourished. So, okay, didn't work. All right, so now, next kind of surgery.
Wait, where did they try and staple it from?
They stapled it basically from the sphincter down through the body in an angle here, so all of this area, not there anymore. Can't be filled. So you only have this little pocket in the pyloric area. All right, so now let's not staple it, let's just cut it off. So they cut most of the body off so that all that was left is just this little pyloric region. Now here's a couple of catastrophes here. First of all, what's the stomach doing for you? Well, in the stomach, which we'll talk about in a minute, it basically takes your solid food and turns it into a liquid. because your small intestine, which comes next, cannot handle solid food at all. So if you have that stomach removed, all your food either needs to be chewed like 1,000 times before you swallow it, or everything better be blended. You are drinking all your food from now on. Or you're going to get food caught in the small intestine, you're going to have impaction, you're going to die. Okay? Not good. Because the small intestine has a lumen that's small, why we call it the small intestine. You get a chunk of steak caught in there, it's going to explode. You're going to release bacteria through the system, you're going to get sepsis, you're going to die. Not a good thing. Another thing, not only does the stomach turn your food into a liquid, but the stomach also absorbs certain things, like for instance, potassium. You don't really absorb potassium anywhere else in your small or large intestine. You're absorbing the majority of potassium in your stomach. So what if when I cut out the majority of a person's stomach, I cut out all of the areas that absorb potassium? What's going to happen to my patient? They die. Because you have learned how important potassium is, right? Okay? Neurological system isn't going to work, muscles aren't going to work, heart's going to stop, and you're going to die. I actually had a student a few years ago who had this kind of gastric bypass, and she did it while we were in class, so like maybe the first half of class, and I watched her. She was losing tons of weight, and then all of a sudden she was missing class here or there. So I'm like, okay, so what's going on? So she told me that she had it, and she said that when she was missing class, she was going to Desert Valley because she was getting shots of potassium. Because she's starting to have cardiovascular problems, her muscles were twitching, she was very tired. And then all of a sudden she was missing more days, or coming in really late. And now she's going to Desert Valley and every single morning getting an IV of potassium. And then a couple of weeks later, the class was almost over. She did actually squeak by with a low C, but she told me that she had to have potassium IV 3 times a day. So I didn't see her for a while, and at the end of the next semester, she came into class, and I did not recognize her. She went from being a pretty large young lady to probably weighing like maybe 90 pounds, maybe 95 pounds. And she came in to tell me that she wasn't going to be able to make it to the nursing program because they told her that she was going to die. She wasn't retaining any potassium, she wasn't absorbing any from her food, and within a couple of months she did die. So this is a big problem for your patients. Many of them that have this kind of gastric bypass will have tremendous symptoms. Another thing that the stomach does is it secretes a chemical called Intrinsic Factor. Now, obviously it's a factor, so we don't know what it is, but the stomach makes it. And what this is for is this is a chemical that absolutely is necessary for us to be able to absorb vitamin B12 through the wall of the stomach, the only place we do it. And for some people, you have this kind of gastric bypass, you don't make intrinsic factor anymore. Now, it's not too bad, you just have to have shots of vitamin B12 once every 2 weeks.
So they couldn't just remove the staples?
No, they cut it off now,
Oh,
no
no.
staples anymore.
Oh, okay.
They just cut it, it's gone. They're not part of the
Performing these surgeries?
Oh yes, oh yes. Now, let's get to the newer gastric bypass. More radical. Because here's the other problem. In this type of gastric bypass, I have enough stomach down here that I can actually slowly begin to eat enough food that I can stretch this area out enough that I can get back to eating as much food as I was before.
But you don't have the,
But you don't have the whole capacity of the stomach. And some people will even explode their stomach because they will go back to eating, 2 or 3 Big Macs and milkshakes and everything else. So, let's not let our patient do that. So now here's what we're going to do. Cut right here and remove the esophagus from the stomach. Cut right down here and totally remove the stomach. And then sew the esophagus to this little teeny tiny pocket right here. And that's all they have left.
so so they don't have it.
So there is no way I can get that Big Mac down without vomiting it back up, because it just doesn't fit. And these are most of the types of surgeries your patients are having now. Or, let's take it one step further. Let's cut the esophagus off here, and let's cut the stomach off here, right below or right above the pyloric sphincter, and so the esophagus onto the small intestine, and there's no stomach at all. Gone. And now we'll make our patients have to have IVs of potassium for the rest of their life. Hopefully it'll keep them alive.
And they have to be on a liquid diet for everything.
Absolute liquid diet. They can never eat anything solid again.
Why would they do
That's
that?
great. I know.
How about you?
Everyone's informed of the
Yes.
prescribe for the potassium and all that.
Oh, yes, they're all informed. They're all informed. As a matter of fact, these patients also have to go through nutrition classes for 6 months before they have the surgery. They also have to see a therapist for a year before they have the surgery. And they have to lose a minimum of 50 pounds before they have the surgery. I had 2 students a couple semesters ago go through this kind of surgery. And in my class, they were working together to make sure they lost weight. They're going to all their appointments, doing a great job. I mean, between the 2 of them, they lost well over 100 pounds. And I said to them, why would you go on this surgery or have the surgery? Just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing fantastic. Nope, nope. Physiology was over. And the next day, they both went in and had the surgery. Now, I gotta tell you, I've seen them since, and they both look so unhealthy, it's really scary. Their skin is sagging, and their color is bad. They don't have the energy they should. It's really sad. I'm like, if you are on something that's working, why would you do this? Well, a lot of people think that it has a real psychological component to it. And that's why they have them go through therapy now, because many of these patients commit suicide. Here's the reason that a lot of scientists think this happens. There hasn't been enough study of the stomach to really understand it. It's kind of a boring organ. Who wants to study the stomach, you know? But the stomach actually secretes a lot of hormones too that affect the brain. There are multiple hormones that the stomach secretes that affect the hypothalamus and areas of the brain that keep us happy. You know that. When you eat certain foods, you feel really good. And you think because they taste good, but that's not really why. Those certain foods actually cause the stomach to secrete hormones that affect your brain and make you happy. So I take the whole stomach out, and guess what? My chance of depression increases. I feel really bad. We even think, in reproductive physiology, that there are hormones that the stomach secretes that actually may help to trigger labor. And there's some studies that show women who have had gastric bypass like this have to have C-sections. Weird. So we don't really know what it does, but we're just pulling it out just, because, well, I don't know. Yeah.
Dr. Harvey, why when you are full, then you feel sleepy?
Why?
After you eat, then you're full, it seems like you're sleepy.
Probably the reason why is because something you ate you're allergic to.
Oh.
Eating food should never make you tired unless you're eating an amino acid called tyrosine. Tyrosine is found in like chocolate and in turkey, things like that. And tyrosine turns into serotonin. And serotonin is a neurotransmitter that helps you to feel happy but relaxed. But most of the time, if you're really tired after you ate something, it's probably because you're allergic to something you ate.
The same thing if you're sleepy after, because most of the time I eat, I get sleepy after.
Sleepy and tired are 2 different things. If you just feel good and you want to take a nap, that's not the same as being tired and not really feeling all that good because you're so tired. That's a very different scenario.
Which one is the lap band?
Lap band. So lap band is like, it's actually kind of like a rubber band that's thicker and goes around the circumference of the stomach, and then they pull it tight to squeeze the stomach in. Kind of like put a girdle on your stomach. Okay? Now here's the problem with the lap band. Most of the time, that band is actually exteriorized. So the control of it, how tight or how loose it is actually on the outside. And the doctor has a little key to it. So I can go to the doctor and say, hey, look, I'm going to a party tonight and I really want to eat a little bit more chocolate cake. Can you loosen this up? Is it on the exterior? Yes.
Is the band elastic?
It's elastic.
So if you eat too much, is it going to stretch out?
Not that much. It stretches a little bit, but not very much. But I can loosen it up so that I have more room. A lot of people do not lose weight on the lap band.
It sticks out.
Yes. Yeah.
Does it hurt?
No.
No.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Very, very similar to that. I know it's different, but you know it's what they do.
Are they expensive?
Yes, they're typically expensive surgeries, but nowadays a lot of insurance will cover it. Yeah. Even Medicare will cover it.
So what are the risk factors of that?
Yeah, that would probably, and depending on who your doctor is, some of those bands slip. So like I've heard of a lot of people going like to Mexico to have it done because it's a lot cheaper, but they slip, and then when they do, they end up kind of twisting around the esophagus. And then again, you can have gangrene from that. So you have to be very careful about who the doctor is. All right, so let's go into mechanical digestion now. I started there and then got sidetracked, but it's all good stuff. So you have muscles in the stomach, and they're going to contract a very particular way. They have a real particular pattern. So those muscles are going to start at the top of the stomach, what we call the fundus, and start to squeeze all the way down to the pyloric sphincter, and then squeeze back up to the esophageal sphincter. So all the way down and all the way back up. Now, not only do those muscles squeeze, but they actually squeeze and twist the stomach. Squeeze, twist, squeeze, twist. So, you know, it's like you're really trying to crush that food as you move it up and down through the stomach. And then also, you remember that rugae, those, you know, kind of twisty things inside the stomach. So when I'm squeezing and twisting the food, it's also going over the rugae and it's helping to break that food up into smaller particles. So all of that is simply mechanical digestion. Now, you can have a problem with this kind of mechanical digestion. It's called gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, or sometimes just called heartburn. So in our stomach, we're going to talk about this next, but we produce an acid that also helps to digest the food. And for some people, that upper, you know, the top sphincter, the lower esophageal sphincter, doesn't close well. It's not as tight as it should be. So now imagine if I have some acid in my stomach and my muscles are doing this squeezing thing, and then when they squeeze back upward, what's going to happen? It's going to pop some of that acid into the esophagus. Now we'll talk about this, but the stomach has ways to protect itself from that acid so it doesn't get burned, but the esophagus doesn't. So when that acid comes back up or refluxes back up the esophagus, you get burned. And so that's why they sometimes call it heartburn. Now the problem is that this happens over and over again for long periods of time. It can erode the walls of the esophagus. And then you get what is referred to as Barrett's esophagus, which is pre-cancer. So if your patient is diagnosed with Barrett's esophagus, this is pre-esophageal cancer. Now we see the same kind of thing too with people who have like bulimia, okay? Where they're vomiting on their own all the time, all that acid is coming back up. So you have the same kind of problem with them as well. The only difference with people who are bulimic versus people who have heartburn is you'll also see erosion in the mouth because it's coming all the way out. So sometimes their teeth, their tongue, even their lips will erode over time because there's so much acid constantly touching in there. So you have to be real careful with this reflux disease because it can lead to cancer. Also, your esophagus has a lot of blood vessels in it. And if the inside of the esophagus erodes enough, this acid could actually hit a blood vessel and cause it to rupture. And then your patient could also bleed to death.
Does the esophagus ever heal?
It can, yes, it can, yes. Any other questions?
Is it squeezing and turning? That's the churning? That's what it's called?
Yeah, that's the gastric motility that we talked about, that squeezing, yes, the churning of the stomach, call it that too. All right, so it's 12:35, let's take a 15-minute break, we'll come back and talk about chemical digestion. A hole is called a hiatus, so that's why they call it a hiatal hernia. And so part of the stomach can pop up, and when it gets through that hole, it pops the sphincter open. So they get the reflux all the time. Now here's the big problem. Your abdominal area is under a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure. So what it can do is first it pops up a little. Over time, let it stretch the leg. So the whole stomach can end up in the thoracic cavity. Which is like great.
Push it back down. She said it was very painful.
Okay, let's talk about the chemical processes of digestion. So if you could take a microscope and look inside the walls of the lumen of the stomach, you would find that there are multiple little holes, kind of like little pinholes. And those holes lead down into these long pits. So in this overhead, you can see here is the little hole leading down into the long pit here, which is called the gastric pit. Now these gastric pits are lined with very particular types of cells. And the cells are always found at the same level in the gastric pit. So that at the bottom of the gastric pit, these cells are referred to as the chief cells. The next set of cells above the chief cells, these are the parietal cells. And then sitting right above the parietal cells are what are referred to as the gastric cells. Or sometimes these are just called the G cells. And then above the gastric cells, you have the last group, which are the mucous cells. Each of these different types of cells makes a different type of chemical for the digestive process. Okay? So let's talk about the chief cells first. The chief cells secrete an enzyme, which is secreted into the gastric pit. And I'm just going to put a big P here for that enzyme. This enzyme is secreted in the form of pepsinogen. And remember, we talked about the OGEN. This also tells us this is inactive. This pepsinogen has to be activated, and then it becomes the active enzyme, which is called pepsinase. Now, the way we're going to activate this enzyme from pepsinogen into pepsinase is by something the parietal cells secrete. The parietal cells will secrete two different ions into the gastric pit. These are hydrogen ions and chloride ions. the hydrogen ions will mix with the chloride ions to produce what is called hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid will then mix with the pepsinogen, change its shape and activate it into pepsinase. The job of this enzyme is to break down proteins.
Different parts of the cell.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute. But the hydrogen ions and the chloride ions are secreted on separate sides of the cell because you don't want them to be able to mix inside that cell. Because the minute you make hydrochloric acid in the cell's destroyed. Same thing with pepsinogen. You don't want it to be an active enzyme in the cell because it'll start destroying the proteins of the cell. So you secrete it as inactive. The gastric cells, they don't secrete anything into the gastric pit. Instead, the gastric cells actually secrete a hormone called gastrin. Now, gastrin has a couple different jobs. One of the jobs of gastrin is that it also increases gastric motility. So it makes the stomach muscles contract, just like the parasympathetic nervous system. This helps to make the stomach muscles contract for digestion. The other important job of gastrin is it is what stimulates the parietal cells to secrete hydrochloric acid, or at least one of the things. So now when we eat food, the majority of food that we eat is actually very basic. We don't eat a lot of acidic foods. Okay? So typically when food enters into our stomach, it causes the pH of our stomach to go up. When we raise the pH of our stomach, this is what stimulates gastric cells, and then they make gastrin. So when we eat food, pH goes up because our food is more alkaline. When the pH goes up, that stimulates G cells to make gastrin. Gastrin is going to cause hydrochloric acid secretion, which will make the pH come back down. And then that turns gastrin off. So pH goes up, gastrin goes up, HCl goes up. pH goes down now, gastrin goes down. HCl production goes down. This is actually negative feedback. So raise the pH, turn on gastrin. Lower the pH, turn off gastrin. It's a way to make sure you don't make too much acid in the stomach, or you'll burn a hole in the stomach. Now,
The excess.
that has the excess what?
Hydrochloric.
It mixes with the food, because the food is basic, hydrochloric acid acidic, it neutralizes. If I make too much though, then we got a problem, because I can burn a hole in the wall of the stomach and get an ulcer. Now, the reason that most people don't get an ulcer is because we also have mucus cells. And mucus cells secrete mucus. So that in our stomach, you've got about 1/4 of an inch thick layer of mucus lining the whole lumen of the stomach, so that the hydrochloric acid can't get to the stomach wall and burn a hole in it. But some people have a bacteria in their stomach, which is referred to as H. pylori. Now, about maybe close to 2/3 of the world's population has H. pylori in their stomach, but not 2/3 of the world's population has an ulcer. So how do you get a gastric ulcer? Okay, now watch. I stress out, which makes my cortisol levels go up. And when my cortisol levels go up, it inhibits my immune system. And because my immune system is inhibited, H. pylori blooms. And H. pylori gets into my mucus cells and turns them off. And now I can't make as much mucus, and now the acid can get to the walls of my stomach. And about 90% of the people who get ulcers, they have very high levels of H. pylori. They don't produce enough mucus, and they burn a hole in the wall of their stomach. So nowadays, when you're treating an ulcer in the stomach, you not only give antacids to help to lower the acid level to heal the wall, but you also give antibiotics to help to lower the levels of H. pylori. But stress is the #1 cause of ulcers, not the food you eat, all the kind of stuff they used to think is the major cause. Yeah, remember that?
So we are going to intestinal. I'm not sure.
Okay, so let's take a few minutes and talk about how the parietal cells work, okay? So we know that there are two things that are going to enter into the lumen of the stomach. Those are hydrogen ions and chloride ions, okay, from our parietal cell. And we also talked about the fact that gastrin, which is a hormone, comes from our G cells and can stimulate our parietal cell. Binds to a receptor and can cause the parietal cells to secrete those chloride ions and those hydrogen ions into the gastric pit, into the lumen of the stomach. But this is a really important process. And so if there's something wrong with the G cell, we might not be able to make hydrochloric acid. So anytime there's a really important process in the body, we always have backup systems. So not only can gastrin stimulate the parietal cell, but so can acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system. It can bind and stimulate the parietal cells as well. Now the weird thing is that there's another chemical that actually comes from our immune system that can stimulate parietal cells. And nobody exactly understands why the immune system is controlling digestion, but this chemical is histamine. So really, in order to secrete 100% of all of the hydrochloric acid we need for digestion, we need all three of those chemicals: gastrin, acetylcholine, and histamine. So let's say that I have a patient that has a lot of allergies, and I give that patient an antihistamine. They're not producing much histamine in their system. They will actually produce a third less of their hydrochloric acid too. So taking long-term antihistamines can also kind of have some gastrointestinal problems for your patient as well. Okay, so we need all three of those chemicals to bind to receptors to stimulate these hormones. Now, or to stimulate the cell. Now, these two, what they're going to do is they're going to cause calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And that calcium is going to stimulate an enzyme called protein kinase. And basically, protein kinase is going to increase ATP production. Now, the reason we need lots of ATP in this cell is because we have 3 active transport pumps that are going to help us pump out these hydrogen and chloride ions. Now, histamine does it a little bit differently. You've probably heard about this before. It stimulates cyclic AMP. And cyclic AMP can also stimulate this enzyme, which can increase ATP production. So we get the pumps going. Now, we're going to get the chloride ions from the bloodstream, actively transport those into the cell, and then actively transport them into the lumen of the stomach. But remember, this is very similar to our red blood cell. In exchange for the chloride ion, we're going to pump a bicarb into the bloodstream. Okay? So we have a little bit different of a pump going on right here. Now, the hydrogen ion is also being actively transported in, and in exchange, we're going to take from the lumen of the stomach a potassium. This is one of the places where potassium ends up being able to come into our cells. Now, this pump also uses a potassium to pump back into the lumen. So you've got to be able to handle this potassium load all the time. Now the only thing we're not accounting for is where did this hydrogen ion come from and where did this bicarbonate ion come from? Well, we know that anytime we produce ATP, there's always going to be a lot of CO2 around. And then of course that CO2 can mix with water in the cell and you make H2CO3, which then breaks apart into a hydrogen ion, and it also breaks apart into a bicarbonate ion. And by the way, always you're going to have carbonic acid right there in that step. So the very last part of the gastric phase is we have to get the food out of the stomach so that we can get into the intestinal phase. Now, by this point, the food has been in the stomach from like 4 to 8 hours, and it has turned into a liquid, a very acidic liquid. And what we call this liquid is chyme. Okay, the CH has a K sound. So this is chyme. So it's a very acidic chyme. And because it's so acidic, you don't want to release it all into the duodenum of the small intestine at the same time. Because then you burn a hole in the duodenum because it doesn't have a bunch of mucus either. So we got to release it just a little bit at a time. So remember, the stomach is doing its churning thing up and down. And as the stomach moves down towards the pyloric sphincter, that sphincter will just kind of pop open a little bit, and you'll squeeze out a little of the chyme into the duodenum. Then it'll turn back up. Then it'll come back down, open the sphincter a little bit, squeeze out a little bit more chyme. So over the next 30-40 minutes, you're releasing this acidic chyme from the stomach until it's completely gone. And you're entering into the intestinal phase of digestion. And we're going to talk about mechanical digestion first. Mechanical digestion is made of two parts. One is peristalsis, and the other is what we call segmentation.
I'm sorry. What was that, Doctor? I was coughing. I didn't hear the second one.
Segmentation.
You not cough with a group that is. Remember man
Look, I have 4 men in my life.
And I'm one of them.
All 4 of them are Marines.
Oh.
They're all in the Marine Corps,
Oh wow.
ranging from a lieutenant to a colonel. Those are my 4 sons. Pretty sure he's not one of those. Sorry. Those are the only 4 men in my life. I have a feeling you better be careful too, because I'm pretty sure they can kick your butt. Pretty sure.
Don't you stare at you, you'll crumble.
They're all at least 6'2" and above.
Uh-oh.
So, a little bit big boys. All right, so peristalsis, we already kind of talked about that, but in the small intestine, what's going to happen is the muscles of the small intestine are going to squeeze, and they're going to move the food through this small tube. But they're only going to move it so far. The small intestine is broken into segments. And so the peristalsis is going to squeeze the food down a segment and then push it back. And then we're going to squeeze the food down to the end of that segment and push it back. So it's almost like we're shaking the food back and forth. Now after it squeezes back and forth multiple times, it'll then squeeze to the next segment. And so we'll move that food down the segment, push it back to the beginning of that segment, move it down the segment again, push it back. Now, a couple of good reasons for that. Not only is it mixing the food up still, but it's also pushing this acidic chyme over top of the villi. Now remember, your small intestine is lined with all these villi. And the acidic chyme moves across the surface of these villi, and it just keeps shaking back and forth across the surface. And what it does is it actually kind of sort of mows the top of the villi off. All these cells at the top literally get shaken off. They pop off. And we want that to happen because these cells are full of digestive enzymes. So when they pop off, they explode in this acidic chyme and they release all their digestive enzymes. Now, basically the top of your villi throughout your small intestine are bald. There are no cells there. But down here in a little region called the Intestinal Crypt, they used to call this the Crypt of Lieberkuhn, but now they just changed it to boring Intestinal Crypt. These cells go through very rapid mitosis. So as soon as we lose the cells at the top, you've got a whole bunch of cells down here that then just through pressure push up on all the other cells, and they immediately cover over the surface of the villi. And now you're ready for the next meal. Now this becomes a problem though for your patients who are going through chemo and or radiation therapy. Because chemo and radiation therapy, they target cells that go through rapid mitosis, because that's what cancer cells are. But then that also ends up targeting cells like our hair cells that go through rapid mitosis. It kills those cells, so many of your patients will lose their hair. And then it also kills the cells in the intestinal crypt. So that when they eat a meal, all these cells at the top are shaved off, but there are no new cells to replace it. So it becomes very difficult for them to eat, can be rather painful. Now the good news is a lot of the new types of chemotherapies especially are being reformulated not to kill these intestinal cells, so that many of the patients don't have as bad, at least, of problems as they used to, because it used to be really, really bad. These cells would never grow, they couldn't ever eat food, your patients would lose a lot of weight, and becomes all kinds of big problems. Now also, most of the absorption of the nutrients from our food is going to happen in the small intestine. And in all these villi, you can see in blue and red here, we have a whole bunch of intestinal capillaries. We also have in green lymphatic capillaries. Now these lymphatic capillaries, I want you to know these are called lacteals. And remember, we talked about this the other day. I told you that one of the things about lymphatic capillaries that's different from our blood capillaries is that they have these valves that can open in the wall. Something can push up on these and then get into the lymphatic capillaries. Now, all of our lymphatic capillaries eventually empty back into the bloodstream by way of the superior vena cava. So anything that ends in the lymphatic system eventually can get back into the bloodstream. Now, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but when we absorb fat from our food, it can't be absorbed into the bloodstream. It actually has to be absorbed into the lymphatic system first, and then the lymphatic capillaries eventually dump it back into the bloodstream for us. And we'll discuss why that happens in just a little bit. Oh, one other thing. So it's become more widespread as far as knowledge is concerned that people are going gluten-free. Okay. Now, gluten is the name of a protein that is found in wheat and found in barley. So in those two plants. And when somebody goes gluten-free, it's typically because they're allergic to that wheat product, that protein. And if you eat gluten, so you eat it in breads or certain cereals, things like that, if you eat gluten, you have an allergic reaction in your small intestine, which means that your immune system starts moving into the small intestine. It secretes histamine, it secretes different chemicals, and eventually what it does is it destroys all the villi. So that if you look at the small intestine of somebody that has a gluten allergy, instead of having all these little hills and valleys because they have all the villi, it's flat. And if it's flat, you can't absorb nutrients appropriately. So a lot of your patients who have gluten allergies, they are very malnourished. And usually, believe it or not, when people are malnourished, they eat more because you're not getting enough nourishment. So you're always hungry, you always need to eat more. So a lot of your patients will be overweight because they eat so much. And the other problem is because they don't absorb the nutrients, all that has to go someplace. So they always have a lot of really, really, really bad diarrhea. So your patient will eat a meal and then spend the next 30 to 60 minutes in the bathroom with terrible diarrhea. Now this disease, not only is it called a gluten allergy, but it's also referred to as celiac disease. So celiac disease just simply is an allergy. This is a really easy disease to cure. You just tell your patient, don't eat gluten anymore. Just stop eating anything that's made with wheat or barley. And nowadays there's a lot of things that say it's gluten-free, but I want you to know that's really a lie. Because the U.S. government has said it's okay if you put about 10 to 15% gluten in that product anyway. It's all right. So you can't, as a patient who has a gluten allergy, you can't be sure that something is gluten-free unless you've made it yourself. Because the government allows these companies to put wheat products in there, which just is horrendous. Because another thing that can happen is if you have this gluten allergy and you continue to eat it, it can then go into cancer. And so, you know, the potential is your patient thinks that they're going gluten-free, but they're not really. And then they end up with cancer. And the number one cancer that your celiac patients get is lymphatic cancer, which is a very difficult cancer to cure.
My son's friend, she has celiac disease.
Okay.
And she says she can't eat corn. And
corn products or anything.
Okay.
She still eats some kind of like bread products.
Okay.
Should she not?
No, she should not. People who have celiac disease can be allergic to wheat and barley gluten, or they can be allergic to corn gluten. But because some corns have a type of gluten in it. But if you're allergic to corn gluten, you're also allergic to wheat and barley gluten.
Yeah, she's allergic to the corn, but she can't have like any.
People who have wheat and barley allergies for gluten only are not necessarily allergic to corn gluten. But people who have corn gluten allergies are allergic to wheat and barley gluten. So she has to cut that all out, and man, that's difficult. That means she could never go on
Yeah.
wheat, ever.
Yeah,
She has to make everything fresh herself if she really wants to stay away from it, because we know every freaking thing is made of corn.
Right.
So, yeah, it's tough. It's got to all be fresh. And you have to be really careful of things too, because they'll say things on a package that it doesn't say wheat or barley. They'll say things like natural flavorings, and that's code for wheat. So like you eat something that's a caramel, and caramel will have like natural coloring in it. That's code for wheat. So yeah, sometimes you even have to call up the company and say, I need a list of what's in here. Or better yet, just make all your food yourself. Okay, so let's talk about the chemical process of digestion in the small intestine. That's it? You forget I'm a mother. As soon as you have a kid, you have supersonic ears.
It's fun. Really? You hear what I'm saying? You hear everything.
Yeah.
I can hear my son.
Okay, so as soon as the acidic chyme enters into the duodenum, we have chemoreceptors, special neurons that are going to be stimulated by this decrease in pH. These chemoreceptors are going to cause the duodenum to release 3 hormones. The first is called gastrin-inhibiting hormone. The second is cholecystokinin, and again the CH is a K sound, cholecystokinin. And then the third is secretin. So this can also be GIH, or this is CCK. Now gastrin-inhibiting gastrin-inhibiting hormone does exactly what its name says. It's going to inhibit gastrin secretion.
In the stomach or in the intestine?
In the stomach. So now because food is leaving the stomach, you don't need gastrin to be produced anymore. So you don't need the stomach to keep churning. So we're going to decrease gastric motility, and you don't need to make hydrochloric acid anymore. So we're going to turn off the parietal cell, and not make this anymore. So we just need gastrin to go away because all the food that we've digested so far is in the small intestine. Now, cholecystokinin and secretin both affect different organs. Cholecystokinin affects the gallbladder, and it affects the pancreas. Secretin affects the liver, and then also the pancreas. Okay? So we'll talk about the gallbladder and the liver first, and then we'll talk about the pancreas second. Okay, so here's our liver, and if you remember, the liver is connected to the gallbladder, and then the gallbladder empties into the duodenum. Okay? Now, the gallbladder, all this is a storage tank. It doesn't make anything, it just stores something. And the gallbladder is just made out of smooth muscle. That's it. And what it's going to store is a product that the liver produces, and this product is called bile. Now, our liver has a lot of different functions, okay? And some of those functions have nothing to do with the processes of digestion. The liver cleans things out of the blood. The liver breaks apart certain waste products. The liver has a lot of different, it makes a whole bunch of different enzymes, and they don't have anything to do with digestion. So we're just going to talk about what the liver does with digestion right now. So the liver produces a chemical called bile. And bile is actually made up of a couple different chemicals. So one of the things that's in bile is cholesterol. And then we also have what's called bile salts. And then we have something called bilirubin. And then we have an amino acid called lecithin. Now the liver, one of the things that it does is it's a big filter. So the liver will filter out of our blood any excess cholesterol that we might have floating around. And then eventually that cholesterol gets mixed in with this bile, which then is secreted into the gallbladder. And then when you eat a meal, gallbladder squeezes, and then it goes into the duodenum. So the cholesterol is just waste. You don't need it, you got too much floating around, let's clean it out and get rid of it. Eventually you just flush it down the toilet. The bile salts are actually made by the liver, and we'll talk about what it does in just a second. However, if I have, and this is one good reason not to eat too much cholesterol for some people. If I have what we call a genetic propensity, so this is all about genetics, this doesn't happen to everybody. But if I have in my genetics this problem where if I have too much cholesterol in my blood, that excess cholesterol ends up in my gallbladder, and it will mix with my bile salts. And usually, here's the genetic part, I make too much bile salts, more than the normal person. So if I have excess cholesterol and excess bile salts sitting around in my gallbladder, which by the way only empties every time I eat, so it could sit around for 4, 5, 6 hours maybe in my gallbladder, those two mixed together in high concentrations crystallizes. And those crystals can become very hard, and we call those gallstones. And sometimes the gallstones, you'll have little teeny ones, and they just pass on out and get into your duodenum. You never know you have them. But sometimes, again, for some people, they will get very large. The largest gallstone I ever saw was in a man who, we were doing an autopsy on him, and no lie, it was as big as an extra large chicken egg, and just as hard as a rock. Now, it took a long time to make a gallstone that big, okay? So this guy must have been in a lot of pain, and he never told anybody, and he never went to the doctor, because bile is acidic. So watch, look at the overhead. So here's my gallbladder, and let's say I have this gigantic gallstone in there. That means that this little duct right here is blocked. So all the bile stays in the liver. It can't get out. And that means all that extra acid is sitting around in the liver, dissolving that person's liver. He eventually died of liver failure. That is painful. You feel that. And he never told anybody. Nobody had any idea there was anything wrong with him. And by the way, gallstones can come in a bunch of different colors too. They can be yellow, they can be blue. It's just really interesting, and some of them are really pretty. I mean, this guy's gallstone, it looked like I said, a giant chicken egg that was made out of, you know, that like that green marble that has the black running through it. It was just gorgeous. I wanted to keep it like for a paperweight for my desk, but they wouldn't let me. Anyway, so this becomes a problem. And again, typically it runs in families. Typically it's genetic. Now we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but bile salts in particular are going to help us in what we call emulsification of fat. Now that's just a really fancy word for digesting fat. So what if I don't have gallbladder? I have a very difficult time digesting fat and absorbing fat. Now, if they take my gallbladder out, watch, okay? What they're going to do is they're going to cut right here, okay? Now that means my liver can still make bile, but there's no storage for it. So let's say I eat breakfast, but I don't eat lunch until 1 o'clock, all right? So I haven't eaten for, let's say, 5 hours. Over 5 hours, if I have a gallbladder, that bile will store in the gallbladder. Then when I eat, my gallbladder will squeeze, and all that bile, all at once, bam, goes into my small intestine and mixes with all the food, with the acidic kind, to break down the fat. But if they cut out my gallbladder, over those 5 hours, the bile is dripping directly, a little bit at a time, into my duodenum. So your patients, or yourself, who doesn't have a gallbladder, you cannot eat a lot of fatty foods all at one time in one big meal. Now you can still eat it, but you have to break it up into multiple small meals a day. Probably, like you these do, just eat all day long.
We both don't have a gallbladder either.
Well, there you go. There you go. So your best bet is when you're going to eat fatty foods, you eat fatty foods all day long because you have a little bit, okay, not a lot, little bit all day long, and all day long you're putting a little bit of bile into the duodenum, which will be enough for you to be able to digest and absorb the fats. But if I have a big meal and I have like 3 pieces of pizza, okay, I can't absorb that fat. So where does that fat go? Out the other end. It slides right on through like butter, and you have explosive diarrhea. Okay? That is not a good thing. Okay? And now your patient becomes very nutrient deficient. It's a big problem. And one of the things I find, and maybe you guys can testify to this, is that doctors, when they take out a patient's gallbladder, they don't tell them this.
Wait, what? Tell me.
They don't tell the patient, I'm taking your gallbladder out, now you're going to have a problem digesting fat, so eat small meals 10 times a day.
No.
If you're going to have fat in your meal. They don't tell the patient this at all.
You find it out the hard way.
It's horrible.
So it's really important that you're giving them this message that obviously fat's going to be in your diet, but you can't eat big meals. You can't eat the 3 big meals a day. If those meals contain fat, you've got to break it up throughout your day, and then you won't have these diarrhea and nutrition problems that so many patients have that lose their gallbladder. So that's really important for you to be able to tell them.
What is the reason why you would lose your gallbladder though?
Because gallstones. Now, if I have little tiny gallstones, okay, what they're going to do if they can't get through the duct is they're going to do what's called lithotripsy, which is basically ultrasound, and they're going to go across the liver, and the ultrasound will break up those little stones, no problem. But sometimes those stones will get really big, and you can't break them up. And the only way is to cut the gallbladder out, because that is very painful, because it's backing up into the liver, and
You would be able to just surgically remove it, just sew it back up, or?
no.
Just
No.
like
Because, yeah, muscle, when it's sewn up, it doesn't heal well. So now your gallbladder doesn't squeeze and get everything out, you're going to get stones again. So it's just better to take it out, or you're probably going to go back in for surgery after surgery. And that's too dangerous because we're talking infection now.
So for the gallstones, are they
And
bypass?
gallstones, yeah. They
When
had
they do
sludge,
that,
like
where
the
does,
bile was
if
so
you don't have
concentrated.
the
it would go through.
gallbladder anymore, does the tracer still go to the duct? Or
Yeah,
it
it still goes to the duct, yeah.
So can you you can't get a clog in that duct?
Oh yeah, you can. You can still get a clog in that duct, and that is very sad. Yeah, that can be a big problem for a person. Yeah. Okay, so the next thing that we find in bile is what's called bilirubin. Okay, now bilirubin comes from dead red blood cells. So our red blood cells are alive in our system for about 120 days, okay? And then after 120 days, because they've been going through all these capillaries and they got to twist and turn, they start falling apart. And so the liver filters all those red blood cells out that are falling apart. And what it does is it kind of tears them apart and it takes the iron out of the hemoglobin and stores it away. Real important that you have a nice storage of iron in the liver, just in case maybe you don't eat your spinach or you don't have enough iron in your diet for a little bit. Your liver's got a nice storage. But everything else from that red blood cell is a waste. And it's what we call bilirubin. And so we want to make sure that doesn't build up in the system, and the liver puts it in the bile, and then eventually you flush it down the toilet. But if something's wrong with the liver and it can't filter out that bilirubin, it starts to back up in our system. And it'll get underneath the surface of the skin, it'll get behind the sclera of the eyes, and bilirubin has kind of a yellowish brown color to it. And by the way, it's highly acidic, so it can be a big problem for us. What do we call this disease? Jaundice. And this typically tells us that the person's liver is failing. They can't get that bilirubin out of our system. Now, some babies are born with jaundice. Doesn't mean they're alcoholics, okay? It means that their liver hasn't fully kicked in yet. And that happens sometimes. So it's not totally up and running. And sometimes it takes 2-3 days after the baby's born for the liver to be at full capacity. Which means the baby's got a little bit of jaundice. All you gotta do is stick them in the sunshine, put an ultraviolet light on them, all that bilirubin will break apart. And then on day 3, when the liver is fully functioning, it clears it all out and, you know, baby doesn't look all sick.
Is it common for preemie babies to have that?
Yes, yes, very common. And that, for a preemie, it may take a little bit longer for the liver to come fully online. So it could be a problem for maybe a couple weeks.
Why does sun help destroy the bilirubin?
Ultraviolet light breaks bilirubin apart. So whether it's artificial or natural.
Why do they say when they have jaundice to breastfeed?
Why do they say when they do? Well, breast milk has way more nutrients in it than anything you can buy over the counter. So they're telling you to keep that baby healthy, to make sure the liver does start functioning fully. You want to make sure that baby has all those nutrients. And on top of it, mom provides all kinds of antibodies and things like that to the baby that they're not even making yet, and sometimes don't make for the first 2 weeks of life. So that's really why they want you to do that. Okay, so now, cholecystokinin and secretin. We know cholecystokinin affects the gallbladder, secretin affects the liver. What cholecystokinin is going to do is it's the hormone that tells the gallbladder when to squeeze. It stimulates contraction in the gallbladder so that the gallbladder can release the bile into the duodenum. Okay, so cholecystokinin is going to stimulate the smooth muscle of the gallbladder and cause it to contract, which squeezes all that bile out, and the bile enters into the duodenum. Okay, so as soon as the acidic chyme enters into the duodenum, we're going to see cholecystokinin being produced and the gallbladder squeezing. Now the gallbladder's empty. So we got to tell the liver, hey, ramp up production of bile for the next meal. That's what secretin does. It stimulates the liver to make more bile for our next meal. What did you ask? Kidney stones could be a number of things, but it's very similar to gallstones. It's usually the buildup of some product in the bloodstream. The number one cause of kidney stones is too much calcium in the bloodstream. So calcium can interact with other chemicals in the blood and crystallize. And that happens a lot in the kidneys because everything slows down in the kidneys, so there's a little bit more time for those crystals to occur. But there's a few other chemicals that can do it too. But most of the time it's calcium. And the way you get too much calcium is either you drink the water in the high desert, which has a lot of calcium in it just because our ground has calcium, or you don't have enough calcium in your diet, so it leaches too much calcium out of your bones. And then you can have kidney stones. So either way too much calcium or way too little calcium, you get kidney stones. Okay, so this is what cholecystokinin and secretin are doing to our gallbladder and our liver. Now let's talk about the pancreas just a little. Oh, actually, got to do one more thing. Let's talk about bile salts. Okay? And by the way, lecithin is just an amino acid, and it just happens to get into the bile, so we don't really care about that. So emulsification of fat. Okay, so now remember, in that mechanical digestion, we're squeezing the food down and it's moving back. And we're squeezing the food down and it's moving back. So it's kind of like we're shaking this food back and forth.
Does it contract it both ways, or does it just contract it?
Contract in one way, push it back. Kind of like your old-fashioned typewriters. Okay? I can say that to you because you know.
Yes, I know what that means.
Most people are like, huh? So awesome. I found an old manual typewriter the other day at a garage sale. So great. It was totally working and everything. I'm like, I'm buying it. And the lady goes, she says to me, she's like 20 years old. She goes, I don't even know what this is for.
I bought one too.
Like, are you freaking kidding me?
This
This is great.
Okay.
That's what I learned to type on. Old manual typewriter. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Those things are such a pain.
Oh, yeah. Well,
In the military.
I know.
no, you mess up. You got to get the carbon copy in there.
You got all the
Don't make a
fingers.
mistake, because then you just have to take it out, throw it away, and start all over.
You can erase, but it's so messy.
Anyway, so we're shaking this food back and forth. So imagine if we're talking about fat. Let's say that I have this glass, okay, and I'm going to fill the glass with water. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour some olive oil into my glass of water, okay, and just let the glass of water sit. What's going to happen to the olive oil and the water? What are you going to see? Okay, it rises to the top. It separates, it kind of, balls up, becomes sort of a glob of oil, right? So then what if I put a lid on my glass and I shake it really hard? What will happen to my ball or my glob of oil as I'm shaking it? It'll break up, and I'll get these little tiny balls of oil, right? But then, what if I set my glass back down and let it just sit for a minute or so? It all comes back, or what we call coalesces. It all comes back together, and you get that big glob again, right? It never just separates evenly and stays separate in the water. Exact same concept in the small intestine. We're shaking that fat back and forth. So we separate it into these little droplets. But now remember, we squeeze it down, push it back. But then it sits for about 10-15 seconds. before we squeeze it down and push it back. And then it sits. So what happens is we break it into little tiny pieces, but then we just sit for a second and give it enough time to come back into a big ball. Those big balls of fat, those big globs of fat, are too big to even be absorbed through those valves in the lymphatic capillary. But if we could shake it really good and get it into the little tiny droplets of fat and keep them separate, the little tiny droplets could get through those valves and be absorbed into the lymphatic system and then get dumped into the blood so we could use it. Well, along comes bile salts. So if we mix bile salts with all this fat and we shake it up and get it into the little droplets, the bile salts will coat all the way around every single little droplet so that when we stop, they can't all come back together in the glob. They actually all stay separate in the little droplets. And then those little droplets can be absorbed into the lacteals or into the lymphatic capillaries. So that's why the bile salts are so important in absorbing, or what we call emulsification of fat. It keeps all the little droplets separate from each other, and they can't coalesce into that big ball or that big glob of fat any longer. So if you don't have a gallbladder, and you don't have all this bile salts, and you're trying to break up all the fat so you can absorb it, not going to happen. And the more fat that you have just sitting around, like I said, the more it gets flushed down the toilet real quick. Pretty much true. All right, so the pancreas. Cholecystokinin and secretin are also going to affect the pancreas in different ways, okay? Now the pancreas, when it secretes, it's actually going to secrete right into the same area at the beginning of the duodenum that the gallbladder secretes into. So they both secrete together, okay? So here's our pancreas, and by the way, the pancreas sits right about here in your abdominal cavity, okay? So it's right about here, kind of like between the stomach and the liver, okay? And cholecystokinin, when it affects the pancreas, it's going to cause the pancreas to release a whole bunch of digestive enzymes, okay? So we have pancreas releasing a ton. I mean, there's like over 100 different digestive enzymes that the pancreas is going to release. Secretin is also going to affect the pancreas, but this time secretin is going to cause the pancreas to release bicarbonate. Why would you want bicarbonate to be released into the duodenum exactly at the same time, or just a teeny tiny bit after this acidic chyme enters the duodenum?
To neutralize the body.
Yeah, you want to neutralize it really fast so you don't burn a hole in the wall of the duodenum, you don't get a duodenal ulcer. Any questions? Okay, last, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One quick question. Okay, so I can't say the word. The CCK and the secretin for the pancreas will both empty into the duodenum when they're released. Like it goes into that duct, right?
CCK or the pancreas?
The digestive enzymes that the pancreas releases.
Yes.
Those
So the
go into
pancreas is going to release these through this duct, into the duodenum.
Okay,
So the digestive enzymes and the bicarbonate
okay.
all enter the duodenum at the same time. Cholecystokinin and secretin come from the wall of the duodenum. They go, because they're hormones, they go into the bloodstream and come back again and affect the pancreas.
Okay.
Or CCK goes into the bloodstream, comes back again, affects the gallbladder. Or secretin goes into the bloodstream, comes back again, and affects the liver. Because they're hormones. So they got to go into the blood and then come back and do their job.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, then let's talk about the large intestine, or the colon. There are 3 major functions. There's a couple minor, but we won't really talk about those. 3 major functions of the large intestine. Function number 1, absorption of water. Large intestine is super good at absorbing water. So let's say, for instance, you have a person who they haven't, really drank very much water today. Instead, they've been drinking a whole bunch of caffeine. And caffeine, by the way, is a diuretic. Caffeine, just like alcohol, inhibits anti-diuretic hormone secretion. So if I drink a lot of caffeine, I turn off ADH secretion from my anterior or my posterior pituitary. And so I'll pee a lot more. So for instance, if I drink 12 ounces of iced tea, I will actually urinate out 24 ounces of urine. So the more caffeine I drink, the more dehydrated I become. So you have to be really careful with drinking tons of caffeine and not supplementing with water, because you can become very dehydrated. I always think it's really interesting because, they say Red Bull and all these, energy drinks are supposed to be there to give you energy. So you drink, let's say, 12 ounces of Red Bull, but you urinate out 24 ounces of water. Now you become dehydrated. And when you become dehydrated, your red blood cells crenate. And when your red blood cells crenate, you can't pick up as much oxygen. And guess what? You can't make as much ATP. So Red Bull actually makes you more tired.
But if you drink 24 ounces of water with it,
Then you're doing better. That's exactly what you can do. Because then you have your energy level that stays up. Instead of getting a little spike and then bam, you're really, really low. So it's really good because it makes you need to drink more and more and more of it so that you can continue having the energy, but eventually you're going to have a crash. Eventually there's going to be a problem. Now what the colon's going to do as you become dehydrated is it's going to suck all the water it potentially can out of the last of this food stuff that you've eaten that we now are going to call feces. So the water just gets pulled out of the feces into the bloodstream to help basically keep your blood volume and your blood pressure up. And some people will drink so much caffeine and become so dehydrated that they end up pooping out rocks. Literally. So the feces is so dry that one of the big problems for them is it continues to scrape against the walls of the colon as it moves through. And as it scrapes, we're talking years of this bad behavior for a person, and it's scraping against the walls of the colon because the feces is so dry. It starts literally digging into the walls. So that instead of the walls of the colon being smooth, these people have these long tunnels dug into the walls. And these long tunnels become a real problem because in our colon, we in other places of the body, we have a lot of bacteria that live there naturally. And those bacteria can get into these kind of pits in the walls and start to ferment and create problems. And food can get stuck in there with that bacteria, and you start getting infections. And sometimes those infections get so bad, you have to cut out parts of the person's colon. And this disease is what we call diverticulitis. And those little pits in there are diverticulum. Now everybody's going to have a little bit of diverticulum by the time you get into like your 60s, 70s, 80s. It just happens naturally. But these people I'm talking about, they have these deep, deep pits. So for instance, let's say they eat popcorn and they swallow a popcorn seed. It can get stuck in that pit and kill them. So this becomes a very, very dangerous disease. And so you have to be very careful of this. So it's great that the colon can absorb water, but sometimes not so great because it can lead to other diseases. So one function, absorption of water. The second, which is like a no-brainer, storage of feces. Now typically, what a person defecates today is what they ate about 24 hours ago. So on average, the colon stores feces for about 24 hours. And the colon has a lot of muscles, so by peristalsis, the food gets moved over a 24-hour period through the colon, okay, and then comes out. But the colon is very stretchy, and it can store a lot of feces. And sometimes you have people who have diseases where the muscles don't work very well. So for instance, those muscles will only contract appropriately if you have enough thyroid hormone. See, thyroid hormones help smooth muscle to contract. So if you have a person who has hypothyroid, they may have constipation problems. And there are people that I've talked to who have such bad hypothyroidism that they may not defecate for a month. Now, a lot of people will go, oh my gosh, that's so terrible, it's going to make them terribly sick. No, it's actually not. It's not actually going to do anything to you. There's no harm in that, except it's highly uncomfortable. They're not going to be happy campers. And you need to get their thyroid hormone levels up so that the muscles of the colon can do that peristalsis thing and move appropriately. What would happen if your patient had hyperthyroid? They'd have a lot of diarrhea problems because everything's moving too fast and they don't store it long enough. So a lot of hyperthyroid people, what we call Graves' disease, they have a lot of problems with diarrhea. People who have hypothyroid have a lot of problems with constipation. Now, yeah, go ahead.
Will they have a hard time, like, absorbing the water?
Yes. Yeah. The hyperthyroid, yes, they have a hard time.
So they have a hard time staying hydrated?
Yes, absolutely. It's not a good disease because blood pressure problems come in, and heart rate problems. Yeah, usually the heart rate is very high. Sometimes I've seen patients who have Graves' disease and their heart rate is 200 beats per minute while they're sitting down. Okay, so it's a big problem. Now, in the 1950s, doing research was way different than it is today. And you could do a lot of things on people that you can't do nowadays. So there was a college professor who had a research grant, and you can pretty much get college students to do anything for extra credit. And this guy, and I'm not kidding you, okay? And this guy not only was going to give extra credit to his students, but he also had enough money that if you were one of his students, he had enough money to pay for all 4 years of your college education plus expenses. That's a lot of money. So he had hundreds of people volunteer for this research project that he wanted to do until they heard what it was.
What it was, yeah, but what was it?
So he told them, what the research project is we want to see how stretchy is the colon. So we want you to go in and surgically, we're going to staple your rectum shut. And see how long you can take it.
Oh my.
Before it
So-
explodes?
No, just before you were so uncomfortable you couldn't do it anymore.
Oh.
Now hopefully it wouldn't explode. Okay. Now of course this is 1950s, what do they know? Maybe it would explode, who knows? It'll be cool to see. And seriously, that's pretty much how projects work. Let's see what this does. Oh wow, wow, really cool. Like, you know, people have epilepsy, so doctors went, oh, you know, I think epilepsy is caused because of this area of the brain. Let's go in and take it out and see what happens. So they did. It didn't cure the epilepsy, and there were some freaky things that happened. So, you know, in the 40s and 50s, it was very different. A lot of fun, not compared to now. So, of the hundreds of students, they all dropped out except one. So this guy went in, he had his rectum stapled shut. And I kid you not, true story, it was stapled shut for 1 year. He was able to handle it for 1 year. I saw pictures of him like about 3/4 of the way through. And he was so full of it, okay, that his stomach was so distended that to walk around the college campus, he put it in a wheelbarrow and rolled himself around.
Isn't there a thing, I forget what it's called, but where you can vomit it if you
You
get
could,
sick?
but, okay, as long as you're healthy, there is a sphincter right here, okay? This is the ileocecal valve, and it prevents backflow. Now, it can happen, but that means that valve has gone bad, okay? Now, obviously for him, the valve did not go bad, okay? I have done some autopsies on elderly people where the valve was obviously bad because when we opened them up, there was feces all the way in the mouth, okay? So the valve can go bad, all right? And it can happen, but usually, it typically doesn't. And for him, it didn't. And here's the other thing. Not only did they figure out how stretchy the colon was, but there was also no other repercussions. And a lot of times you'll hear things like, oh, well, you know, if you don't defecate in so much of amount of time, there's toxic things, and that is not true, okay, unless you're eating toxic food, okay, which could be possible nowadays, okay, but unless there's toxins in your food, how are toxins going to build up in your colon? It just doesn't happen. And one of the really bad things you never, ever, ever want your patient to do is you do not want them ever to use a colonic. Because what happens is they insert this watery substance, usually soap and water, into the colon, and it causes massive diarrhea, and it's supposed to clean out your colon. But you see, not only does the colon absorb water, not only does it store feces, but your colon has very important bacteria in there. And if you wash those bacteria out, and at last count, they believe there's over 20,000 different types of bacteria in your colon, and we only know what 2 or 3 of them do for us. And if you wash them all out, one of the things we do know is that your patient becomes very ill. So obviously those bacteria are working for us in a variety of different ways, helping us. So you really want your patients to stay away from those colonics. Here's the other weird thing. You'll find your patients who do these colonics, and typically on a regular basis, will become addicted to them. So somehow that bacteria has a connection to the brain as well.
Why are they so popular?
Because there's a lot of lying out there. There's a lot of myths about how all these toxins are hurting you, and it's just not true. Having a colonic is going to hurt you far worse than having feces build up. Far worse.
How can you not, like, because you know when you have like food, you have like that feeling. How can you resist the feeling of like?
It was stapled shut.
I know, but like.
Well, yeah.
I didn't say he didn't have the feeling. I didn't say it was not uncomfortable.
But I mean, for a whole year, like, that's ridiculous.
Well, he's a starving college student that got all 4 years paid for of tuition and expenses. I think he was pretty happy afterwards. Yeah. Now, here's the really sad thing. After they took the staples out, they didn't follow him. They didn't see what happened afterwards. I mean, not in the bathroom, but days and all afterwards. Okay. And that would have been really nice to know what was happening with him after the fact. But they just took the staples out and that was it. So that's
Could he
really too
have
bad.
like health side effects from that?
No idea. See, that's just it.
So we don't know if he died.
You know, I do know that he did not die, at least in the 4 years of college. After that, who knows what happened to him.
Maybe he called a plumber after.
I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure. So the third important function of the colon has to do with those bacteria. The colon helps us to produce vitamin K. Now, vitamin K is necessary to create blood clots. So if we're bleeding and we need to clot that area up, you have to have vitamin K. If you don't have vitamin K, you basically become a hemophiliac. You can't clot anything up in the blood. Now, our colon doesn't produce the vitamin K. It's the bacteria in the colon which does. We have a bacteria that lives in the colon called E. coli. It lives there naturally in all mammals, and it helps to produce vitamin K. So that's another problem. If we wash that out, you may not have enough vitamin K to be able to clot your blood appropriately. Now, by the way, this E. coli lives in the colon naturally and doesn't make us sick if it's in the colon. But if that E. coli gets into any part of our intestinal tract, gets into the stomach or the small intestine, it will cause us to become very sick. So like on that Food Inc. video, that E. coli came from the colon of those animals that were slaughtered. And then that E. coli was on their meat. And when the hamburger gets blended inward and you don't cook it all the way through, which is what happened for that little boy. It happened, the Jack in the Box that they went to was having a contest. And Jack in the Box in the state of Washington, they all were having a contest. Whoever could sell the most burgers per hour, they all won prizes. So they weren't cooking them long enough. And so the hamburgers weren't cooked all the way through. If you cook the hamburgers all the way through, then you kill the E. coli, you denature them, they're dead. It doesn't matter, even if they're in there, you've killed them. If you cook a steak on the outside, you can eat as raw as can be in the middle. There's no E. coli there, but if I take the steak and I blend it into hamburger, then the E. coli is in the middle. If I eat that E. coli and it gets into my stomach or small intestine, it can then wreak havoc. And potentially, if it's the hemorrhagic E. coli, it could kill me, okay? When you get food poisoning, it's usually because you've eaten E. coli, okay, that shouldn't have gotten on your food. And a lot of times you get E. coli from eating at a salad bar. Because the people who made your salad didn't wear gloves and they didn't wash their hands after they went to the bathroom.
So that's what causes produce to carry it?
That's right. Well, that's one. The other thing is that a lot of farmers use manure on their plants, and nowadays that manure has E. coli in it. And so that's the other problem. And like apples, if you drink apple juice or whatever, now it's pasteurized, because apples will fall off the tree onto the ground, and there's manure on the ground with the E. coli. So now to make your apple juice or applesauce, they have to heat the apples up first and then produce everything. And of course, anytime you heat anything up first, you don't have all the nutrients in it that you would have if it was just raw. But you can't afford the E. coli.
Would that also be a problem for the people with the bad ileocecal?
Yes, absolutely, because it's backing up into the other parts of the intestines. Absolutely. Now, we even see people when that happens, it can get into the bloodstream as well, and they'll die from sepsis.
What causes the colon to like flip or something, or like become like detached, or like I don't remember what the actual term is, but like happened to my grandma where like her colon, like was it like twisted or flipped or something?
The colon, not the small intestine. I couldn't even begin to tell you. I don't think I've ever even heard of that happening. That's probably a pretty freak accident. My guess would be the connective tissue wasn't holding it in place, and when peristalsis occurred, it twisted. I can't think of any other reason that it would happen, unless maybe she was in an accident, and that was probably connective tissue problems. Otherwise, I'm not really sure, honestly. Any other questions? Okay, so on Monday, you have your next exam. This exam, you know, is going to have 100 points of essay, and then it's also going to have 50 multiple choice questions, which will cover everything that we've gone over up to yesterday, but not today. The gastrointestinal system will be on your final exam. Okay?